I'd always been fascinated by them myself. I joined here about 4 years ago and I saw them. I hadn't actually looked at them. I looked at coroner's inquest reports in newspapers, but not the real thing. And I was fascinated by them. And one of the things I often found was that, say, if people were doing family history, which is what most people do when they come in here, and they know where people were from, it's a really good idea to look for some good coroner's inquests in that area, on the townland, because you're going to get great descriptions of life in the late 19th century, early 20th century out of it. Now, there's a coroner's inquest. This is a cartoon done about 1820. It's set a little before 1820. It makes a mockery of the coroner, which is a terrible thing, and it makes a mockery of the whole system. There doesn't appear to be a medical attendant, although I'm not really sure about this guy here. He has the look of a kind of a satirical medical attendant. What it says there is, underneath the caption is, juror, and that's the juror talking to the coroner. The coroner has a white wig. The man's alive, sir, for he has opened one eye. The coroner, sir, the doctor declared him dead 2 hours since, and he has to remain dead, sir, so I shall proceed with the inquest. So, I suppose he's making fun of the coroner and of the medical system and authority in general. By and large, nowadays, say doctors aren't figures of fun, and neither are coroners. Coroners probably are figures who are misunderstood more than figures of fun, because nearly everybody thinks that coroners are medical, except the coroner himself, which I didn't fully realise until right now. That's because we'd be looking at the CSI and the kind of crime things coming from America, and because, broadly speaking, the role of the medical man, the pathologist, has got bigger and bigger from the 1800s to the present in coroner's inquests. And I suppose it's hard to imagine the point of the coroner's inquest without a medical man in attendance. So this kind of shows the kind of, I suppose, the informality of a coroner's inquest in the 1820s. Now, broadly speaking, I called the title, the thing, The Mysteries of Life and Death. And I suppose the first thing that the coroner's inquest does is it tries to figure out what happened. Who is the person who's deceased? What happened? When did it happen? And see, is there anybody? Well, nowadays it doesn't try and identify people responsible, although it may identify likely culprits if there's a homicide or if there appears to be a homicide. But in the past, their role, they had a less neutral role, you could say, less legally neutral role. We find that there's inquests in most cultures. There's a Chinese textbook, inquests of some sort in most cultures. There's a Chinese textbook of the 1100s, which discusses how to determine the cause of death where there are doubtful cases. And it does a little bit of pathology, and there's a little bit of on the legal side of things. And it seems to be that there were traveling agents in the Chinese bureaucracy, at least in the 1000s, 1100s, 1200s, who did the function of coroner. But the office as we know it, the office of coroner as we know it right now, and as we know it in areas where statute law developed, goes back to the Middle Ages. It goes back to the Anglo-Norman England, essentially. Its role in the early phase, its role from about the 1100s to the present has gone through a number of different transformations. And it's probably worth pointing out exactly how it happened, because I suppose as lay people, when we start looking and thinking about the coroner's inquest, we have all sorts of false notions in our head. And so it's worth looking at what happened over a period of time and to put what the coroner was doing in Armagh in the late 1880s in context. The first coroner was an officer of the Crown, which is where the word coroner comes from. With in the early stages, 1066 is when the Normans won England and occupied England. But there was quite a deal of tension in Norman England for the next 50 to 100 years between the natives and the Normans. And one of the things that used to happen was isolated settlers would be bumped off. And the institution that was set up was basically a kind of an informal office of coroner who would fine villages where a corpse is turned up on the presumption that the corpse was probably the corpse of a Norman. And it was up to the villagers to prove that the corpse was actually not Norman but was English. And that's so that there had to be an inquiry into the death. So when a body was found, it was assumed it was probably Norman, and it had to be proven otherwise. And so there would have been a little inquest of sorts where the villagers would have tried to prove that the corpse was English in order to avoid paying a fine. The fine would go to the Crown, and the person who was carrying out the inquest was a Crown officer, a coroner of sorts. I don't think the actual name was in use at that stage. That would have been going on in England in round about the 1080s, 1090s. The Office of Coroner itself, the other thing that this particular officer had to do was to check whether, if it was shown that the body was the body of somebody who committed suicide, then the property of the person was confiscated and went to the Crown. And he had a number of other financial and tax roles. So his role was quite strange. It doesn't really seem to relate. It did deal with dead bodies, but it didn't deal with the kind of situations that we normally think of today. The Office of Coroner was established in, I think it was 1134. Magna Carta talked about coroners, and the Office of Coroner as the official post was formed in 1134. And he was given administrative role rather than judicial role. The idea was, even at that stage, that the coroner, this officer, would look into the death, come to certain conclusions, but would not try anybody. That was up to the travelling judges at assize. I think we have quite a lot of stuff. The National Archives in London has quite a lot of stuff relating to the early, the medieval coroners, mainly because the coroner who was working in the 1100s, 1200s, 1300s had to write up their reports, gave it to the Court of King's Bench and on piped rolls, and eventually it ended up in the, a portion of them ended up in the National Archives in London. And I've got it. Now, hang on, I skipped one there. Yes. Now this is the later one, this is 1562. The first coroner in Ireland was appointed about 1260 or 1250, and like other ones, there was a kind of an element of counterbalancing the power of the sheriff in the appointment of the coroner. The coroner was the king's officer, and he looked after financial details that were the matter of the crown. So he made sure that the crown wasn't shortchanged when anything happened, because the sheriff was a very powerful officer who was notoriously acquisitive, and if there was no crown officer available, it was reckoned that he would compromise his office and be overbearing. So 1240 was when the first Irish coroner was appointed. Now, the medieval, you could say there was a kind of there's three different phases. There's four different phases of the coroner. The very first phase, when it was established, when the coroner was kind of a strange mixture of a financial officer, a taxman, and a person checking homicides and killings. Then it went into all kinds of different activities during the High Middle Ages, and that's when you get, I suppose, the conduct of the officer of the coroner is the role is impregnated by the sense of the cosmos being alive at the time. So you get until about 1400, 1350, you get in England, you get animals tried, where there were accidents because they're seen as responsible, so they're dealt with at an inquest. You get the deodand or the murder weapon destroyed because it's seen as having a kind of a malign properties. So there's an element of the magical and or the cosmically alive in the role of the coroner at that stage. And in a sense, at all times, there's a tiny element of that even nowadays, because you have a death. Death in itself is a mystery, and it's an insoluble mystery, which is partly why we're kind of fascinated by it. But you have a death and you want to see what happened in case somebody is responsible, and it's not just a death from natural causes. But the reason you're doing that is because people feel uneasy. And people do feel the need to have their fears and anxieties allayed. And that's part of the function of coroner. And you can certainly see that. I don't know exactly how it works today, because things have, there would be a different attitude. There's so much state regulation that it's hard to know where the kind of emotional effect of the emotional work of coroner begins and ends. But certainly in the medieval period, there's a sense that a death occurs, it might be seen as unnatural, and it needs to be inquired into, and people's fears pacified. And that continues in many ways, although it's not spoken about. And you can certainly see that in Armagh in the 1880s and throughout the period. Now, I would reckon the actual number of inquests in the medieval period isn't very high as a proportion of all the deaths. And partly that's because the office of coroner was a very wealthy man. He didn't charge fees, and he was mainly interested in making sure that, in looking up peculiar deaths, and also making sure that when deaths occurred in aristocratic families, that they weren't tainted in some way so that the transmission of property wasn't corrupted. They were less interested in ordinary deaths. So the actual proportion of coroner's inquests to the total amount of deaths was probably at its lowest in the Middle Ages and up to the 1750s or so. Now, by the 1550s, the idea that animals would be tried was gone, and all kinds of the kind of medieval superstitious elements of the coroner's inquest had died away under the pressure, I suppose, or the kind of the rigor under the rigor of the Reformation, which was seen as irrelevant. And by and large, at that stage, the function of the coroner was essentially to just look into human death and find causes. It was still, the main concern was aristocratic death, by and large, unless there was something exceptional happening. This is again, everything was recorded. At that stage, the pipe rolls ceased. But from about 1400 until about 1750, the records were in Latin, and they were passed on to the Court of King's Bench, and they've ultimately ended up, a portion of them again, in the National Archives in London. So in Ireland, we've lost all that stuff because that was in the Public Record Office in Dublin. There might be the odd little bit fragment somewhere, but by and large it was all lost. But England, for England and Wales, there's a really good corpus of material available to look at. So this is a rather blurry image of a 1562 inquest into the death of a girl in an aristocratic family in England. Now, let's see what comes next. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, the Office of Coroner was mainly awarded until the 1600s to people who could afford, who were regarded as people of honour and conscience, whose word could be trusted, and who had the money to be, as was the usual thing in the Ancien regime, if you had a lot of money, it was assumed that you were independent and impartial. Now, in the modern world, we're slightly more sceptical. If you have a lot of money, it may be assumed you're probably not impartial or independent, but it was seen differently in the 1500s and 1600s. This is quite a late statement. It's a statement by a committee in London in 1834. But it states the kind of broad thing that it was preferable to have, rather than a professional expert, it was preferable to have a gentleman of experience, respectable character and liberal education to fill the role of coroner. Now, up to the 1600s, they didn't charge fees. They were mostly fairly well off. After the 1650s, attorneys began to take over the post, and gentlemen became more reluctant to do this kind of a task. Probably something was happening other than just social change among the aristocracy. Probably, although I just don't know what happened, there were tasks being assigned to the coroner between about 1600 and 1650 that were unpalatable to the aristocrat. It may be after the war, the Civil War, the English Civil War, various things were going on, and I would imagine that the aristocratic families tended to withdraw from the role. But anyway, attorneys began to take ownership of the office from about the 1650s. And really, these attorneys were appointed by the Crown, or in Ireland by the Lord Lieutenant. At this stage, it would have been a relatively small part of the business of the lawyer. And you still had a relatively small number of inquests compared to the total number of deaths. There was an estimate in the 1760s that in England about 1% of all deaths were looked into. And that's I must ask yourself later, but my understanding is that it could be 20% or even 30% of all deaths are looked into in some way nowadays. So there's really a big change. But 1750s, relatively small number of deaths. There may have been slightly more deaths looked into in Ireland, and there's a complex set of reasons for that. It seemed as if from the 1780s, the activity of coroners in Ireland began to increase. Broadly speaking, Ireland was a country where you got unrest. It wasn't really any more violent than England, but the violence was seen to have political character and to seem to be more hazardous to the exercise of authority. So people worried about it more. And you had the development of police forces in Ireland from the 1780s, and you could say this a kind of state legal apparatus that was about 40 years ahead of the same thing in England. And part of that was an increase in coroners' inquests because they started prosecuting, the Crown started taking up the job of prosecuting, and good inquests, sometimes post-mortems, were seen as crucial to the Crown case in court. So you began to get, between about 1750 and 1800 in Ireland, you had a significant increase in the number of coroners' inquests. Now we don't know yet, it hasn't been studied enough to know fully why and how big that increase was, but we know it was there. For most of this period, I have to say, in fact I'm slightly contradicting myself, the coroner's inquest was carried out, attorneys were the coroners. Medical assistants in England weren't really part of the coroner's inquest very much until the 1800s, 1820s. They were more involved in Ireland than in England, but they weren't a powerful part of the coroner's inquest at that stage. It was mainly a legal inquiry, and sometimes the coroner, who would be a solicitor, a very substantial solicitor, would call in medical witnesses, but he often wouldn't. I think but the medical side of it had more profile in Ireland than in England, and you can kind of see in the British world as a whole, medical pathology was a good bit behind France and Germany. France and Germany were always much more interested in medical pathology, and you had pathology taught in schools of medicine from the 1790s, 1800s in Paris and in Germany. And the Scots in Edinburgh, the physicians there began to look to France and pick up details of how to carry out post-mortems at that stage, around about between 1790 and 1820. The very first book in the English language, the first textbook, medical textbook on English pathology, was actually by a fellow called Deasy, and published in Dublin, an Irishman called Deasy, published in Dublin in 1794. So there seems to have been a call for medical pathology in Ireland at that stage, and I think that reflects the fact that it had a bigger profile here when it came to inquests. And we also know that although there was about 80 coroners in Ireland in 1800, 1810, and the number in Ireland stayed at about 80 to 90 throughout the 19th century. I'm not sure how many there are nowadays, but there was about that number for the 19th century. And unusually, the very first coroner appointed in England who had a medical background was a fellow called Wackley, who was appointed in 1839. But there were, as early as 1810, there was about 7 or 8 out of the 80 coroners in the Irish scene who were doctors. And one thing you've got to remember is, so obviously pathology was bigger. It seems that, again, between about 1820 and 1830, they were teaching pathology and taking it seriously, and doctors were required to take exams in pathology in Dublin as well as in Edinburgh. It kind of moved from France, the influence moved from France to Edinburgh, and then Edinburgh to Dublin. Now, people up here, as you'll see later, they often studied in Edinburgh. People from County Down, Armagh, Antrim, all that area, kind of northern part of Ireland, had very close contact with Scotland and tended to study there. So they picked up the elements of pathology. Now, very briefly, when the people we're looking at in Armagh, there's 3 particular coroners, there's 3 parts to 3 districts in Armagh. They all called themselves, they would all have been attorneys in fact, but the medical people they called in all called themselves surgeons and physicians. And basically, just as a very brief background, the physician in, say, 1750 was a doctor who didn't do anything hands-on. He just looked at the patient and pronounced his verdict. The surgeon, I mean, I'm simplifying things, the surgeon was a guy who did the practical stuff. He did the operation, he bound up the limbs, and he administered the medicine. The apothecary was the guy who made up the medicine. By the 1820s, doctors tended to be both surgeons and apothecaries. And by the 1830s, a surgeon and apothecary was known as a general practitioner. So most of the country doctors who were called into inquests in Armagh in the 1880s were country doctors, and they would have called themselves surgeons and physicians, but they weren't physicians. The physicians were really like the consultants who were too high and mighty to get their hands dirty, and perhaps presented the lectures in Queen's or in the College of Surgeons in Dublin or places like that. Not in the College of Surgeons, but the College of Physicians in Dublin and places like that. So there was a kind of a caste system in the medical profession. But the people that would have been coming along to inquests they rarely called themselves general practitioners, but the term wasn't unknown. But there would have been both surgeons and apothecaries. So there's a lot of these are all kind of background details. Now, as I said, Deasy was the first guy in Ireland to start talking about pathology. There was a number of guys in Scotland, Christensen and others, who started looking at the effect of poisons and how to detect poisons, and also looking at how bruising changes after death, looking at bodily temperature, all these kind of practical things that we associate with post-mortems and inquests nowadays, to see exactly, to work out the time of death and to work out whether, say, the marks on a body are indicative of violence or not. So a very simple amount of pathology was being developed in the 1820s and 1830s. And this was filtering in to the knowledge of the country doctor, by the 1830s and 1840s and 1850s. Now the number of inquests was rising all the time, but up until about the 1830s in Ireland, it wasn't necessary, it wasn't required to bring in a medical witness. You could have an inquest. The inquest was held by the coroner, who was a law officer, but sometimes a medical man. But nobody was required to bring in medical witnesses. And it wasn't legally mandatory to do post-mortems, you know. They did happen, but it wasn't mandatory. It was entirely up to the coroner, and the coroner could simply open and close an inquest without any medical advice. This wasn't the case. The 1836 Act in England changed matters here and in Ireland. And it's kind of interesting. The Medical Witnesses Act. Now the fundamental problem was money. The coroner was paid. Originally he was a gentleman, he didn't need to be paid. Then he became a solicitor and he had to be paid. The people who paid him were the grand jury in Ireland and the quarter sessions in England, out of the public money. By and large, in England, there was some difficulty, but he generally got paid. In Ireland, there was always a lot of difficulty about getting paid. And the idea was that the grand jurors, he would carry out the inquest, he would pay the witnesses. If he could get away with it, he wouldn't get a doctor, because that would reduce his costs, his expenses. And then he would send his bill of costs to the grand jury. So he would have to have the money to do this before he could do the inquest. And the grand jurors weren't terribly sympathetic, because they would look at the bill and they would say, look, if it obviously wasn't a violent crime, why did you bother doing an inquest at all? And this gets into a whole very interesting question of why inquests were done and who decided to do inquests and how deaths were called to the attention of the coroner. But in any case, it wasn't in the financial interest of the coroner to do too many inquests. It was better for him to do a small number of inquests and then he could be sure of his money. That's basically the way it worked. And in fact, up until the 1830s, medical attendants got better wages in Ireland than in England, but they were more regularly paid in England. Now, when this act was brought in, it was made mandatory to have doctors at inquests in England, but it wasn't made mandatory in Ireland. But the rate of pay, the scale of pay was introduced, and you were given a guinea for an examination, so just looking at the body and giving your opinion, and you were given 2 guineas if you had to do a post-mortem, and that's the way it worked. There was witnesses, other witnesses might sometimes be given money, a little bit of money if they had to come a long way for the inquest. But all of this, the coroner had to dispense all this money, pay everybody, and deal with all the expenses, and then he got it back eventually from the grand jury. Now he didn't, the crucial thing was, he didn't intend to pay the doctor, because they were both professional gentlemen, and the doctor didn't expect to get paid, or was, well, he wasn't happy about it, but he didn't intend to get paid until eventually the coroner got paid. And sometimes he got paid less than he expected. And there was always tension between the medical men and the coroners, because the medical men felt that they knew what they were doing, they knew what they were talking about, and that the legal men didn't, and that the medical men should be in charge. That was the way the tension was. Now, in Ireland, strangely, this act applied to Ireland, but for some reason the grand jury just simply denied that it did, and there was always doubt raised about whether it applied in Ireland. The 1846 Act was brought in to change things, and the 1846 Act set out coroners all over the country. It set out coroners' districts, so there was 2 coroners' districts in Monaghan, there was 3 in Armagh, there was 3 in Mayo, all that kind of thing, and it set up a proper system of appointment. It also made it mandatory to bring doctors, or medical men, doctors essentially, to inquests. Now that didn't always happen, mainly because doctors got a bit cheesed off because they weren't always certain of their pay. And there were certain particular kind of cases, sometimes for instance abandoned infants, where they felt pretty sure they weren't going to end up getting paid and they didn't bother turning up. So that continued as a small proportion of cases right up into the 1900s. Now, the next mid-century, the big thing, let's see now, fees in Ireland were set out as a guinea and 2 guineas. But as I say, the problem with the Second Act in particular was it really muddied the waters. It meant that what they did was, it said that normally the coroner would come along, give a bill of costs at the assizes. There's 2 assizes every year, spring assizes and summer assizes. The grand jury would look at it and would always fight and say, you shouldn't have done that inquest, you shouldn't have done that inquest, it wasn't necessary, we're not going to pay you for that, and we're going to give you less than you're looking for that. So there was always a problem. From 1846, things actually were made worse, because there was a cap put on the amount of money that the county would pay at any assizes. In Ireland, it was put at about £50. Now, when you think that a guinea or 2 guineas is just the cost of doing a post-mortem for the doctor, and that's not the costs of the coroner, because the coroner has his fees, which are higher, and that's not the costs of everything else, because there's all sorts of costs in getting it written up, in getting witnesses to a place. There's a whole load of other costs in setting up the inquest, in travelling and everything. So I don't know what the overall thing, but I would expect, and certainly an average inquest might cost about £6 or £7. And I think that could be cutting it fine in the 1840s or 1850s. So if you put a cap of £50, you're only going to get about 10 inquests. That could be in a very big county area, with a big population. So it really made things very difficult. And to be fair to coroners, they tended to do the inquests. They did a lot more inquests than they got paid for. That's really what happened. And the doctors basically they had to deal with the problem that they often would get. Instead of getting a guinea or 2 guineas, they would get 5 shillings or 10 shillings. But by and large, the number of inquests kept going up. Most of these inquests were dealt with pretty fairly, and they were dealt with as a matter of, you could say, moral integrity and duty, kind of civic duty, because I can't see that they would have got paid, because it just, when you look at the finances, you can see they weren't being paid. They couldn't have been paid, or they were being paid a pittance. Maybe not a pittance by the standards of the peasantry, but certainly by the standards of educated gentlemen at the time. So the fees problem remained, and the fees problem wasn't solved until 1898. It didn't. Essentially the problem was the coroners should have been salaried officers, and the medical people should have been salaried officers. So then they got their salary, they did their job, that's the way it worked. But it wasn't dealt with. So you had this problem all the time. And you had a problem that, one of the ways they got around the problem was that doctors would say, look, I'm only going to get 5 shillings for an inquest. Okay, I'll go to the inquests, but I want to get a monopoly of the inquests, and that'll make it worth my while. I have to make an income, I have to go and do my duty, but I need to survive. So they would make deals with coroners and say, look, if you give me all the work, I'll come along. And that's the sort of thing that happened in Ireland in the 1850s and 1860s. That was stamped out in the 1870s by the Irish Medical Association. It's a complex issue, but by the 1870s, the Irish, and this is reflected in the Irish Coroner's Bill, the Irish medical profession, the medical profession generally in England were reluctant to give too much status to pathologists, because they felt that all the jobs would go to specialists. And they wanted to keep the work for country doctors. And the idea of the convention, the moral convention, was that if somebody died and there was a question to be raised, then the right person to do the job, perhaps the right person to do the post-mortem, was the doctor who attended the deceased. So your local doctor, your local GP was the right guy to do it. It seems kind of strange now. I can't imagine if I suddenly dropped dead, my local GP sort of doing the thing. It feels weird, but that's the way it was done. And the other thing would be, if that wasn't possible, it would be the nearest country doctor, who would be a surgeon apothecary, a general, almost invariably a GP. Now, throughout all this time, you can certainly see one way in which the fees affected things is that post-mortems were quite few. It's reckoned that post-mortems were carried out in about 6 to 7% of all inquests in Ireland in the 1850s and 1860s. So it's a tiny proportion, and that's a very significant thing because I'm talking, I have to say this, I have a coroner here who knows what he's talking about. I'm an historian, and an historian is defined as somebody who doesn't know what he's talking about. And I mean that very seriously, as someone who wants to know what he's talking about. Because you're studying something else. You're studying agriculture, you're studying coroners, you're studying engineers, but you're not actually a coroner or an engineer. So I'm not sure of what I'm going to say, but I do try to understand it, so I'll see if what I say is true. If you don't carry out a coroner's inquest, or don't do a post-mortem, you run a serious risk, in many cases, of not telling what's going to happen, or not being able to tell whether there is, say, foul play or not. Now, the last example that I'm going to pick is a good example of that in Armagh in 1889. And it's a kind of a nice thing to show it. But you had almost no post-mortems. Only about 6 or 7%. They just looked at the body and they looked for what they called marks of violence. Now, the body was usually just on a table in a room. I'm not so sure that they went through the whole. The way a body is cut up now in an autopsy, the way it's done now is pretty well the same way as it was done, 200 years ago. The basics of actually laying out the body and so that you could see everything very clearly and you could open up the body was done then. You don't get the impression, looking at mid-19th century Irish inquests, that sort of thing was done. Now, an example of how they should be doing something like that came with all the body snatcher cases. There's a kind of there was a load of body snatching going on in Edinburgh, famous Burke and Hare, but there were other gangs in London. And there was one case in 1831, I think it was, where there was a young boy, an Italian street entertainer, I can't think of his name now, and he was apparently murdered. His body was got by a pair of body snatchers for sale as a cadaver, for dissection and sale. His teeth were taken out and sold to a dentist. It's a kind of a gruesome thing. They looked at it, they were pretty sure that obviously they had committed the crime of, well, it was a crime, of actually tampering with the body. But they couldn't tell whether the body had been killed or not. Had he actually been murdered? Maybe he had just dropped dead and they found the body and they took the teeth. And they were about to take probably the hair and everything else as well. And the initial decision was there was no marks of violence. And it was just going to be natural causes. And it was only after a lot of argument with the coroner that they decided, look, we're going to have to look more carefully, we're going to do a post-mortem. And they found that the part of the spine had been broken. Now, I don't know how that didn't leave marks on skin, but it is not at all impossible for these kind of acts of violence to occur and not leave marks on the skin. And certainly I've seen a lot of references to that sort of thing. Now, maybe it would be picked up nowadays, but with better technology, looking perhaps, subcutaneous abrasions and things like that with laser technology and things like that, but and looking at it through different lights. But in those days it was quite easy to miss marks of violence or to miss the evidence of violence. And they showed afterwards that the way they used to kill them was they would kind of knock them out in a fairly easy way that would minimize at least the evidence of violence, and then just put their head into water. And again, with the post-mortem, they would pick up water in the lungs if that was inhaled. So it was kind of a good thing to show that you needed a post-mortem if there was any doubt at all. But this wasn't carried out in most Irish coroner's inquests in the mid-19th century. And the key reason was money, because it would cost extra money and they were unlikely to get it back. So That's really the reason. Now, the Irish Coroner's Bill wanted salaried officers. They actually, up until the 1880s, the Irish medical profession wanted coroners to be doctors. They didn't want lawyers involved. But strangely, they backtracked in the Irish Coroner's Bill and they wanted lawyers. But they wanted them to be salaried and they wanted doctors to be salaried as associates. What was going on in that, I don't know, but I know they did that. Now, in 1887 in England, the coroners were made salaried officers, and all the kind of problems of fees and everything that had such a knock-on effect on how things were done was eliminated. And you also got very advanced pathology brought to bear on coroner's inquests to a greater extent. You had home office pathologists, you had home office laboratories, all that sort of thing was done. Now you had a little bit limited amount of that in Ireland as well, but it took 1898 until 1898 before the Irish coroner was made a salaried officer. Until that time, and I've just left this out, the coroner was actually elected. There was a period when he was appointed, but from the 1850s he was an elected guy, and he was elected by county freeholders. He tended to be quite a political guy, so it didn't seem appropriate. You know, looking at it now, you wouldn't think it was appropriate, but certainly the process of appointment was formalised in 1898 and he was made a salaried officer. So that eliminated a lot of the basic problems. Now I'm looking at Armagh in the 1880s, the late 1880s. And so you can see where Armagh fits in. It's still, the problem of fees is still there. Certain of the monopolistic practices have been eliminated. But you know, it'll be very interesting to see how things were going on. Now, the documents I'm looking at this is the face of the document, the coroner's inquest file. There was a kind of a pretty standard printed form, and it was just filled in. It usually amounted to, this is the face of it, it would be the inquisition taken on the body of James Smith, verdict, suffocation from drowning, accidental, John Francis Small, coroner, printed at the People Office. And he would get that printed himself. He was responsible for printing that up. And it just went through. There would be each witness, this was taken down, each witness spoke, and you get a sense of what happened. Now, like a lot of documents, things aren't always what they seem. In fact, it was like a little court of inquiry, and the coroner would ask questions, the jurors would ask questions, there might be a lawyer present who would ask questions, all sorts of things would be going on, but they're not reflected in these documents. Although you do get the sense sometimes that stock phrases are being used, and it's not just a verbatim account. So you have to be a little bit careful. Now you get better accounts in newspapers, but you get very, very good stuff in this too. So that's an internal bit, and this is taken down and it's read back to the witness, and then the witness signs it. Now, there's another one, and you can see it's partially a printed form, and that's scribbled down. And there's an example of how certain parts of the evidence are actually crossed out. And again, it's treated like a court of law, and certain things are left out. I'm not really sure. I would have thought that wasn't totally appropriate, because it's not exactly, you want to know everything. But anyway, you see these things crossed out there. You can also see how that's a much easier one to read. The other one is a bugger to read. And there's the final thing, which gives a list of jurors. Each juror is signed. It gives the verdict, and it's County Armagh. There's again John Francis Small, and these are the jurors. Most of them could write. The jurors were they weren't the poorest of the poor. They were people who paid £4 towards poor relief in any particular district, and so a lot of them could read and write, but you do get a lot of you get a proportion who couldn't, and This is a kind of close-up of that particular thing with the seal. It's a lovely document with the kind of green seal. And then this is an example of where 10 out of about 14 jurors couldn't read. So it's a very nice thing. You can just see their marks. Now, so these are the documents I'm kind of working from. And these are the Armagh Coroners, 1888. William Atkinson, Lurgan, John Francis Small, Uri, Thomas George Peel, Armagh. They're all very active political guys. You'd see them in elections. They were very substantial solicitors. And they parcelled out the place between them. They all more or less did the same number of inquests in a year. These are the medical practitioners. There's a couple I left out. And it's very interesting. There's a very, very good book on a biographical dictionary of Ulster doctors. And there's a lot of them doing this. I realise there's still an awful lot of work to do because more than half of these doctors don't appear in the Ulster biographical dictionary of doctors. The ones that do have nearly all studied in Queen's. A couple of them have gone over to Edinburgh and they've done pathology. So they're quite interesting. They mostly describe themselves as surgeons, but sometimes just physicians. Most of them don't do postmortems. Now, actually, I'm going to go back to this. Now, very briefly, the coroner hears about a death. How does that happen? Well, that's a kind of a mysterious process because in theory deaths had to be registered, but that sort of thing wasn't necessarily in 1840s, 1850s, 1860s Ireland. That was a kind of a fairly unclear thing anyway. It wasn't necessarily enforced very well. But he has to hear about a doubtful death. In fact, what tended to happen was the local police would contact the coroner and let him know that somebody had died and there was reason to believe that there was something wrong with the death and it was worth looking into. Now, how did the police know? The police found out because it was just the public opinion at the place. It was just the consensus of neighbours that there was something the matter with this death, or there might be something the matter with this death, and it should be looked at. And this gets back to that whole thing of allaying a sense of unease and anxiety in the community. That's how the inquests came to the coroner. He waited for inquests to come to him, and it was ultimately the neighbours who alerted the police, who alerted the coroner. That raises all sorts of questions, obviously, about what, the prosecution of murder and whether secret homicides, how easy it was to escape. And in the Victorian period, it seems to me it wasn't too difficult to kill somebody and get away with it. But so the coroner would come. He would hear about the death. He would go to the place. He had 2 days to set up an inquest, and if he didn't do it in 2 days, a magistrate could do it. Or a couple of magistrates could do it, but generally they weren't bothered because there was a lot of time and trouble and expense. But he had 2 days to set up a legal inquest. He'd arrive and he'd talk to people, and he'd make a decision there and then. Look, people are talking about this, but is it really worth looking into? If he decided it was worth looking into, and often he decided it wasn't, but if he decided it was worth looking into, then he would get the police would summons the jurors, and he would summons the witnesses. The jurors were people living around who were reasonably well off farmers, you could say, in most country areas. I haven't got to the point where I can tell exactly who was called. In other words, I don't know if members of the family were excluded from the jury, or members of the kin group, or exactly what happened, or members of the townland, where people from the townland that the death occurred on. So, but they were certainly from the district, and they would certainly know the area, and there would be a kind of a balance between independence and distance and relation there. Now, so that's how the thing was set up. They would go to the place, and the court was set up, or the inquest was set up. It was roughly along the lines of a court of inquiry. People were called in, they were interviewed. everything was transcribed and notarized, and the body would be viewed by the jury before the inquest began, and the body was usually not in the same room as the inquest. It would usually be, perhaps if it was a 2-room cottage, it would be in the next room. If it was done in town, and 50% of the inquests I'm looking at were done in towns, it wasn't unusual for the body to be brought to a mortuary, the local workhouse infirmary or someplace like that. But the jurors would view the body, and especially the medical guy would look at the body, and then they would go through it and they'd come to a verdict. Now, in Ireland, if there was a suspect, the coroner had the right to remand the suspect. Even though he wasn't trying the guy, he had the right to make sure that the suspect was put in jail, detained, until the magistracy did something about it. But he didn't gather any further evidence. The coroner's jury would come to the verdict that somebody seemed to be responsible, but that was then taken up by the authorities as a prosecution matter, and it was left out of their hands. Now, that doesn't happen nowadays, apparently. It's just really a much more neutral. They don't look at responsibility in that sense. So it was a kind of a different process. Now, I looked at 80 inquests in Armagh, and I went through them all, and I just looking at all sorts of different aspects. What was it like? And the first thing I looked at was, say, there's about 80 inquests, is age group of inquests. And this is the profile I got. We've got about 6% who are little babies, really infants, and I'm talking about newborns. Children 3 months to 5 years, about 5%. Children 5 to 14 years, about 2%. Young adults 15 to 35, 20%. Middle age, about 20%. Elderly were nearly 50%. So it's a certain kind of profile, and I looked at that and I thought it was quite skewed, actually. There's a lot of interesting things about it. I mean, say, by and large, and I'll talk about this, there should have been more infant deaths. And it gives me the impression that newborns were found abandoned and nothing happened. They didn't even go to an inquest. The second thing is, I think the actual proportion of deaths among children 5 to 14, in fact children 3 months to young adults up to about 20, should be higher. That's where you get most accidental death nowadays. I think I'm right in thinking that. You certainly get a fairly significant proportion of accidental deaths. So it puzzles me that that there aren't more inquests for those age groups. I think I can see a reason, but I'm not sure about it. These are young adults, and these are things like injuries at work and stuff like that. And you're talking about physically active young adults who are out in the workplace, out on the farm. They're more active than elderly people, and they're more liable to have accidents, at least. Now, the middle age is kind of roughly the same as that. The elderly, 50 is elderly in those days. Still isn't it? Anyway, but it's interesting that so many of them are, there's such a big proportion. And I think that overall, the kind of inquests reflect various social factors here. I think that deaths of children were accepted stoically. They weren't looked into. People didn't imagine that children, if a child died, it was just accepted that it was just a tragedy, and people didn't look any further generally. Among the elderly, I think at this stage in society, you had a situation where the transmission of property, the transmission of economic power was kind of blocked. Mostly these were people, now this isn't quite, it's not quite true, it's a very complicated thing because you had a semi-industrial society in Armagh, but by and large farmers and that were holding on to land until they died, and it only passed when they were quite elderly. And I think the status of the elderly was higher. And so that when an elderly person died, it was looked into. It could be that somebody had been bumped off because somebody wanted their land. That sort of thing was seen as an important possibility. And I think there could be a general question of status there as well. But it's an interesting thing. And it also it could reflect aspects of the fee structure, in that, by and large, if you went to the grand juror and said you found a baby, the baby it looked like it might have been abandoned, we had to look into it, the grand juror would just say, look, don't annoy me, you're not getting paid for that. And that would be the way it would look. And that would be probably young people generally. So they were more likely to actually take seriously inquests into the elderly. Now, there's an interesting thing. Now, I haven't done the overall analysis, but most of these, like in terms of comparative analysis, but most of these are men and some of them are women, which is, I don't know how that plays out nowadays. It may simply mean, well, there's all kinds of things, that men tended to be more in public activity and women more in the home, and but then the home is a fairly dangerous place. Now, these are the verdicts that were picked, and in these things you get now there's one thing, this covers about 80 cases. One thing that's left out is there's no murders there. There's only child murders, you know what I mean, but there's no sort of grown-up murders there. Now, that's because when there was a finding of homicide, the documents were attached to the Crown prosecution. So I haven't had time to sort of see how many homicides should have been among those inquests. Generally, about 3% of all inquests had a finding of homicide. That's the overall thing. So it wouldn't skew it too much. But in these cases, you get burns and scalds, 6%, accidental drowning, 6%, brain inflammation, a couple of percent, physical injuries, 10%, asphyxia, suffocation, 5%, suicide, 15%. I was surprised at how high that was. Cold and exposure, 10%, heart attack, 14%, traffic accidents, that's carts, horses, railways, all that sort of thing, 6%, child murder, abandonment, 4%, chronic illness, 5%, choking, 5%, internal bleeding, 2%, took poison and a fall, and then unclear. So it's a kind of now it's not unusual for 19th century coroner's inquests. Now, the number of post-mortems, out of 80 inquests, there was only 4 post-mortems. So when they say inflammation of brain, cardiac weakness, most of this is just a supposition. It's a diagnosis made on the circumstances of the case and how well the doctor knew the person and just what he observed, the signs that he observed on the body. So it's you can certainly see, again, the number of suicides. I mean, this is a kind of a classic thing, but by and large, it's generally accepted that suicides are underreported. And in the traditional inquest, and it could be just as true in the modern inquest, the verdict of suicide was steered around. Now, I was quite surprised that sometimes they'd be quite forthright about it. And some of these suicides, they just said he hanged himself, but he could have his feet could have reached the ground, so he definitely deliberately hanged himself. Sometimes they go for a temporary fit of insanity. But more often than I expected, they were just quite forthright and said they committed suicide. In other cases, they took poison and it looked pretty like suicide to me. Some of the drownings looked very like suicide to me. But they just said fell into canal, fell into water and drowned. But when you look at the overall circumstances, you think the likelihood of suicide is high. So work-related accidents are kind of physical injuries. One of the things you get with those physical injuries, those coroner's inquests, is that they did their best to avoid blaming the authorities. if somebody was working for the railways and they got killed, they were knocked down, or they were doing something dangerous, the coroner's juries tended to avoid imputing blame. Now, partly that was deference, but partly it was also a practical aspect of deference, because this was a time when compensation was coming into play. And the railway companies, employers, builders, all the rest, they hired lawyers to go to the coroner's inquests to steer the verdict. And it's pretty obvious when you actually look at the inquest. So they're quite interesting, those. Now the next thing is town and countryside. When you actually look at the different inquests, you find that, okay, first of all, it's half of them are in countryside and half of them in town. But that's only part of the story. Actually, the truth is that nearly all the inquests were beside towns. They're either in towns or beside towns. They're either in Armagh City or just around, in Lurgan or just around, in Newton Hamilton or just around, in Uri or just around. So you could see how the coroners were really only picking up doubtful deaths in the immediate vicinity of their own practice. You can see how that would be convenient, and you could see also how that could naturally arise, depending on the way that death was brought to police attention. So all sorts of things become evident there, and it'd be very interesting to see how salaried coroners, worked. But that's how it worked then. Now, the other thing that you pick up on, there's a load of little things you pick up on all the time, but one of the things I picked up on, and this may be a function of the fact that most of the people were around the towns, is that nearly all these inquests were done on poor people. They weren't done on rich people. There's only one person who looks reasonably prosperous, whose child died of burns, scald, in which case there was a coroner's inquest. Everybody else was poor, or they were relatively poor. They were peasants, or they were quite poor people in towns, which is kind of an interesting thing. And it was also obvious that nearly everybody had some contact with doctors, which again surprised me, because the doctor would come along and the doctor would say, yes, this person attended, and I was working with it at the dispensary or somewhere else for the last year. They had chronic illness, they had bronchitis, and I was treating them. And this is not what you'd expect. This is, 1888, 1889 in Market Hill or in Uri or Lurgan. So it's really quite surprising. Now, the one thing to add about that is that they were useless, by and large. And that could be also connected, because you didn't get the impression that the doctors could do much about most of the diseases that people were suffering from. And you can see that where somebody has been ill for a long time, they go to the dispensary, they get some sort of medicine, but they don't seem to get any better. Now, I don't know if that would have been different if they were going to a doctor and they were people of means. I just don't know. But it's worth bearing in mind that this period covers the transition from, this is the early stages of, you could say, scientific medicine. And the thing about scientific medicine is that it had great prestige from the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s on. But in many ways, it was the 1930s and 1940s before, in a practical sense, doctors, scientific doctors, were able to do much for people, or do much more than previous herbalists and stuff could do. So they had prestige, but they had an exaggerated sense of their own powers. But in any case, this is a dispensary queue, and they get tickets, and dispensary tickets and that appear quite a lot. Now, this was 1880s, 1890s. I showed you the coroner's thing at the start. But this was Armagh Infirmary in about 1895. Now, this is not reflecting an inquest, but it's reflecting the sort of medical facilities that existed at the time. And things look an awful lot more. It looks a bit primitive, but it looks very much like a modern thing. You're talking about early 1890s, doctors had stethoscopes. They had all the different kinds of knives and scalpels and scissors and everything. There was a sense of hygiene. All that sort of stuff was there. But this is the thing that applied. The inquests weren't carried out in a medical setting, they were carried out in a legal setting. Now, and they could often be pretty heated. And the coroner had to be careful. Now, I'm going to go, when I was doing this, I looked at ordinary inquests. I didn't look at the big inquest at the time, and I was caught out when somebody asked me the question. They said, why didn't you do the Armagh Railway disaster? You did 1888 and 1889. I said, oh God, no, I forgot about that. But really, that would have been too difficult. That's a huge case in itself. And I was looking at ordinary inquests. Most of these were quite small scale, but there were inquests that were very big scale. And that would be maybe people killed in, say, election riots, the Armagh inquests, things like that. They'd be held in courts, a large number of people attending them, all that sort of stuff. But most of these weren't like that. Now, I'm just going to very quickly give you a couple of examples. This is I'm going to give you 5 cases and then I'll let you go. I hope it's not 2. This is March 1888, St. Patrick's Day, Flush River, Lurgan. Robert Walsh was playing, he was an older boy and he was playing with some young boys. They called to him, there was something in the water. He went down, got a stick, kind of pulled it in, turned it over, and a hand came up. And he saw that it was a baby boy. One hand was tied across the heart with a piece of bootlace, and there was a lump of cloth around the neck. But it doesn't seem to have been strangling him. He ran and told a man nearby, who got some women who came down, wrapped up the baby, and brought it to the policeman. Now, in this case, Samuel Agnew, who was the Lurgan medical man, he made both an external and a post-mortem examination, which is very interesting, because usually they just ignored these abandoned babies. But he actually went to the point of doing a post-mortem. And he confirmed that the child had been born alive, was full grown, and obviously had died of starvation after about 8 days, because he reckoned contents were empty and he just hadn't been fed. And eventually he just died and he was put in the water. They were discussing whether he had been suffocated or not. There was no marks of violence on the body. They also looked at the navel string, reckoned that it was cut but it wasn't tied, and there might have been a bleeding, and that might have led to death. But they had no idea who might have been responsible for this, and in a sense this was done out of respect for the child, really, and respect for this situation. Now, Newry, Hill Street, this is to get you into the feeling of Newry in the 1890s. And this is one of these awful cases. A child died of burns. Now, there's loads of these things, and you can see how it happens. You get parents, they're poor, father and mother both have to go working. The father's off doing labouring job, the mother is working in a factory or something. She has to leave the children in the house. They keep a fire going, there's 2 or 3 children, they've all sorts of precautions constantly on the go, but things go wrong and one of the children goes too near the fire and gets caught and gets badly burned, or even sometimes not badly burned, but if they're very young, they die from shock. And one of the things that's very obvious is that the doctors could do nothing about this, and they never ever managed to, I don't know, you just felt that they were helpless in the face of burns and these kind of things. You didn't get a good impression of medical expertise at the time, I have to say. But so this is a kind of a thing. The poor child, and one of the things that's really awful is that usually you'd have 2 or 3 children, one older one minding the younger children, and in the end the older child would be made to feel responsible because they turned their back, they looked around. In this case, the older girl was looking out the garden, looking at rats, and turned her back for a bit, and then the child got caught. And it's a real, I don't know, can you read that? Yeah, I mean, like it's kind of heartbreaking because this is the mother talking, and the child is saying, "I'll never go near the fire," but of course the child dies about an hour later. Now, The next thing is a suicide case. An elderly farmer, a bachelor farmer, John Mcclane, Tangerine Parish. His house servant was Bridget Murphy, working with him for about 20 years. She said he'd been depressed. He's been in a strange other way of his mind for some time past. The last fortnight he was worse, he was in bad spirits. And about a week or more ago I heard him saying he put an end to himself, he didn't seem to get better. Anyway, he was mooching about the house, complaining on the night. She went to bed in a room. He slept in the kitchen area on a settle bed. She slept in a little room, actually with his 8-year-old nephew. And woke up early in the morning because she heard him moving about the kitchen. Came out and she came out and he just said he was getting something to drink. She put the fire on and he said, I should go back to bed, it's too early to get up. I'll try and sleep as well. He went back to bed and then she heard more noise and she obviously must have been suspicious, went out and found him in the bed, but he had cut his throat, covered in blood. And he just said, I threw the razor in the fire, I finished off myself, I don't want to live anymore. And she got the police took him down to the barracks, there was an infirmary there, they kept him alive for about 6 hours and then he died. But the verdict was suicide due to unsound mind. And the doctor knew him and knew that he had been ill and depressed for a long time. Now this is Newry, the canal, and again to get the setting. And this is another rather heart-rending one. It's a suicide, and it's a woman, Elizabeth Thompson, who was born and raised in Newry. This is the testimony of a childhood friend of hers. What happened was, 22nd of December, a couple of days before Christmas, on the Tuesday, she turned up in Newry. She'd been over in Glasgow since about 1875. When she was in Glasgow, she met her husband, a fellow called John Thompson, or John Burgess, married him and had a couple of children. Only one survived. And in 1888, he was a 12-year-old boy, and for some reason he was living down in Dublin. Anyway, Elizabeth had been over in Glasgow, and she was in the hospital in the Glasgow workhouse for about 6 months, and they decided to get rid of her. It was decided that she didn't have settlement in Glasgow, so the people responsible for her would have to be Newry, or her hometown. They were the people who were supposed to take care of her. So they sent her over to Newry, and with an attendant. She arrived at about 10 to 9 on a Tuesday morning. After about 5 minutes in the workhouse, she said, oh, I've got lots of friends and relations here, I want to leave. And so they said, okay, fine, you're discharged if you want to. They let her go off, and she spent the next couple of days. She seemed to be fairly well dressed and fairly well nourished. And she seemed happy, but that's according to the workhouse master. Anyway, she wandered around Europe for a couple of days, staying in different places, pawning everything she had. She pawned her boots, she pawned virtually everything she had to pay for lodgings. Eventually she turned up on the Thursday night to see her friend, and her friend had seen her a couple of years before and given her a bit of money. She needed a bit of money she said she got a place and 4pence would cover her for the night. And she talked away, she stayed a couple of hours with her friend and Jane Gracie, and then she disappeared, and that's the last anyone saw her. She turned up in the canal the next morning. She was taken out, and she was a laundress by trade. She was taken out, and when they looked at her body, in the left hand that was clenched, there was a card of recommendation to Elizabeth Thompson for admission to the Newry Fever Hospital, dated 21st of December 1888. And signed John Strain. So she could have stayed in the Newry Hospital, in the Fever Hospital. The other hand was stretched and part of her shawl or dress was held between her teeth. I found some papers. On one piece of paper was the name John Burgess, Airless Post Office, Ingham County, Michigan, Box 57. On another sheet of paper appears to be a letter addressed by her to a person whom she addresses as Dear Johnny, and it's signed Lizzie Burgess. Some pawn tickets were there as well, and a small purse containing 10 halfpennies and coppers. So it's pretty rough, and it looks like suicide. It's described as an accidental drowning, and the jury say, oh, there wasn't enough railings on the canal. But It just doesn't look like that, and it's a kind of a typical example. Now, I've got a couple more. I've got a railway pointsman, and they were always overworked, and they tended to, that's the Great Northern Railway, and there was a death in Portadown in 1888, and a railway pointsman was killed in the middle of the night. And it's, the main concern of the railway company was to make sure that they weren't blamed. There's a railway pointsman. They tended to be heavily overworked, and it was quite dangerous work at night. There's the points thing. I'm skipping a bit of this. And that's the 6 or 7 years. Now the final thing is the thing I said about a fellow called Joseph Sewell, who was a 27-year-old man who died suddenly and was found on the street in Lurgan. His wife said he was a newspaper seller. He left the house at about 8 o'clock in the morning to get the train up to Belfast, to collect a whole of the newspapers. He was going to bring them back and sell them. Maybe he'd sell some in Belfast too. Anyway, she didn't see him again. And she was quite worried because he didn't appear at night. She locked up the house, but nobody knocked or anything. Anyway, he seems to have come back to Lurgan, and he was wandering around the house, wandering around town, meeting friends in the evening. And between quite late, between 12 and 1 o'clock at night, this is a description, he was helping Mrs. Stair to flit, so she was just moving house or something like that. And I went down Railway Street with him. He went away up by himself, up the town in the direction of Lord Lurgan's mill. We were all on friendly terms. That's the last guy to see him, a fellow called Eddie McGeer. And he was found on the street, and the decision was that he was just died of exposure. And that he seemed to have a bit of drink taken. There was some vomit. Suddenly somebody began to, I don't know what they noticed. There was no marks of violence, nothing like that. But they did a bit of thinking, and they did a post-mortem, and they found strychnine in the stomach. And then they started looking back at the body, and they said, oh yeah, it does look like strychnine poisoning. You know, and it's like a perfect example of, well, when you do the post-mortem, things are going to happen, and you may see things that you just would not have happened. It was an inquest which was going to end up with a verdict of accidental death, exposure, probably drink involved. It turns out there was strychnine involved. It's not clear whether he killed himself or not. He had been a medical assistant in the dispensary, and he used to collect strychnine from a pharmacist for perhaps to kill pests. He would give it to the person running the dispensary, and he had a permission to do that. Now, all these things were regulated by the 1880s, and you had to sign a schedule of poisons. Everything was signed in the pharmacist. In fact, a pharmacist was somebody who could sell poisons, as opposed to an apothecary. But in this case, he was dismissed from the job as a medical assistant, and only about 6 or 7 days before that, he went to the pharmacist and he got the strychnine, and they didn't realise he'd been dismissed, so they didn't make any issue about it. It's not clear, so he got the strychnine himself, so it looks like suicide. But it's an interesting example of how post-mortems were vital. And then it raises the question of all the inquests in which no post-mortem was held. Now, I think that's about it. I'm probably